had I paid full price for all of my projects, it would be like going to Disney World for a single day every month. My personal knitting project total for the year came out to
I'm Nora, and this is also known as Nora.
Hello there, I'm Nora, and you're watching, also known as Nora Knits. Thank you so much for joining me today for my favorite video to make, which is everything that I knit in 2024. If you are new here, like I said, I'm Nora. I'm coming to you from a small farm in Connecticut. Typically on this channel, you can find my weekly podcast every Saturday morning at 9:30 a.m. where I discuss all things knitting. And specifically, I really like to focus on budget, having some thrifty finds, and celebrating all the ways in which the imperfections make something so perfectly handmade. I love to encourage others to be a fearless knitter, a fearless maker, and I definitely think that the things I've made this year reflect all of those values. So as I have documented my project costs over the past year, I thought that it would be fun to present them to you in order of what the full price project cost would be from lowest to highest, so we can work our way up from the most affordable project to the most expensive. And then at the end, I will let you know what I paid for these projects. The way that I quantify the price in general is if I were to try and replicate this garment right now today, how many skeins or balls of yarn would I have to go out and purchase right now? How much would the pattern cost me, additional expenses? And that is how I have taken note of my yarny habit over the past years. I have 22 projects that I'm really excited to talk to you about today. So I think that without further ado, we should go ahead and dive on in. First up, coming in at the most affordable all-around project at $11.95, we are talking about my Nettie Scarf, which was a test knit that I had done earlier this year for Lily Kate France. It was a really fun, quick knit, my first time knitting any sort of shawl or scarf or something like that. And I utilized this smaller scarf opportunity to use up a little bit of leftover yarn that I had hanging out in my stash. So I used the Hjertegarn Lana Cotton 212. I'm going to just add into the conversation here the next project on my list, which is also the Nettie Scarf, and just a little bit of a larger version that I had made as a gift knit for my aunt that I had made with some thrifted yarn, which is the Louisa Harding Grace. I had an immediate turnaround from doing the test knit to then actually making quite a few modifications to knit this second version with the amount of yarn that I had. This one is extremely different from everything else because it utilizes lace, which is not something that has been my friend this year. And I just really enjoyed the way that this texture was built up. And I love Lily Kate's attention to detail and design, specifically in this one, the way that everything is bordered with this more chunky kind of line. I think that she had said she wanted it to look like you took like a giant marker and just outlined the whole scarf shawl. I really love this. I know that my aunt really loves the one that I had gifted her. She wore it to Thanksgiving this year. Of course, as accessories, these were a couple of the quickest knits that I had this year. Mine versus the one that I had knit for my aunts were on the needles for 4 and 12 days respectively. And that's the Nettie Scarf by Lily Kate France. Next up, coming in at $39.62, we have my Cordelia Skirt, which is by Witchery Design. I knit this skirt out of Drops Bell, and this actually, of all of my knits this year, for my personal yarn cost, this was the cheapest. Of course, Drops yarn is known for being more affordable than most, and I really loved working with the Drops Bell. I think that it makes for such a gorgeous summery fabric. Now, this skirt is knit from the top down, and it features the striped pattern, but also within the stripes, there's actually a little purl row that goes along each of the contrasting stripes, which I think just makes this one look so expensive. Now, there is actually a matching top that I am planning to knit this year in 2025 to go with it. It just got away from me this year. But I know that when I was making this skirt, I was kind of overthinking choosing the sizing for it and feeling like I had to knit a gauge swatch and then try and kind of make my own size between sizes. So getting started with this one, I remember just being a little bit more of a hassle. However, in the end, it wound up being so much more simple than I thought it was going to be, the entire process. And I just really love the finished result. I think this totally looks like something that you would buy in a store. And I think part of that is the colors that I did choose to knit it in, which was mint cream and black. So when you're looking at this, it's not quite as stark a contrast as a bright white and the black. It really does have this more like subtle kind of beachy, a little bit less contrast look to it. And I just adore the way that that turned out. I did knit this skirt in the size extra large in the end, and it wound up taking me 78 days to complete. This year was really my first time getting into any sort of summer knits, and the next pattern we have to talk about here is the Sailor Swift top by Veronica Lindbergh, for which the full price project cost totaled around $39.66. Now, this year, I also knit with Knitting for Olive for the first time. This tank top is made out of Knitting for Olive extra fine merino, and that was actually left over from another project that I'm going to tell you about in a little bit, but that yarn was gifted for that project, and I just had a few balls of it left over and thought it was a really good fit for this pattern. Now, if you've never followed a Veronica Lindbergh pattern before, that's Kutova Kika, and she just has, first of all, like the greatest style, and her patterns are so easy, so refreshing to follow. And for me, this garment was a little bit of an eye-opener because I've kind of touted myself as someone who really does, I prefer to knit garments. I'm really not much of an accessory knitter. And I always envy those people who could have just like a hat on the needles or socks on the needles for fun. And that was something that they could keep in their purse and walk around knitting all year. And I never understood how you could get so invested into those smaller projects. So when I knit this Sailor Swift top, I felt like this was the start of something dangerous for me, where it doesn't take up a lot of yarn and it doesn't take all that much time, but also it's for the most part just stockinette in the round. And so it's really nice to have something like that on the needles in the purse. And I definitely see myself in years moving forward coming back to this pattern just to have something easy. It is top down, which I dabbled a little bit in some bottom up construction tank tops. And while the hit the ground running factor is so nice in those bottom up constructions, the entire time you're knitting, you're like, oh gosh, what am I going to have to split for the front and the back and then worry about all of these little components on top? Whereas the Sailor Swift tank top, you do knit from the top down. So as long as you have a good weekend to kind of bang out all of the little more finicky bits, I just found that that top down construction was really nice and kind of got all the junky stuff out of the way. This was definitely one of the smaller needle projects I did all year on a 3mm needle. And in total, this one took 29 days. Next up, coming in at $41.20 is my Folklore Cardigan based off of the Lion brand pattern out of Lion brand Wool Ease. If you've been here for a little bit, you know that this project was a huge investment mentally for me. And it was really my first time kind of overhauling a pattern. This is an all over cable knit cardigan and it's done in pieces. And I was actually knitting this up as a gift for my little cousin. So her size wasn't exactly part of the pattern. The yarn was gifted by her grandma grandma, my aunt, and it was just a really fun kind of collaborative project for me, but it also really, really kind of put my brain to the test this year. I made a lot of modifications to make this whole thing smaller, and so much so that I actually made an entire video just dedicated to the making of this folklore cardigan. I'm so proud of this cardigan for all of the work that I put into it, but I also think that for me, this one is really symbolic of the fact that this yarn is an acrylic wool blend, and I've always been extremely passionate about the fact that you could knit with the finest yarns and you could knit with the cheapest yarns. And obviously they all have their pros and cons, and you're supporting different people by making different purchases. But I think that this yarn is a true testament to the fact that whatever you knit with, it was made with your own two hands. And that is one of the most beautiful things. The person, the recipient, even if it's yourself, you're never going to think back on how much the yarn cost or what the quality of the yarn was. You're always going to be so proud that it was something that you made and you put the love and time into. That being said, this one did hang out as a WIP for a total of 47 days. And that really says something, because this was the smallest garment I made all year, since it was for my little cousin. It spent even more time on the needles than a lot of my own garments, but I think that just goes to show you that some things take a little bit more time. Next up, we have the Tolsta Tank by Rebecca Clow, which clocks in at $42.22. Now, I'm sure that you've heard of this pattern before, and this is actually what I was talking about before with that bottom-up construction. The Tolsta Tank includes all of these different options, as a lot of Rebecca Clow's patterns do. And this is another one that I chose to modify a little bit, where I knit the front as the cami style, and then the back I actually used the back of the crew neck style that's included in the pattern. And what I think is really funny is that in the end, I wind up wearing this one technically backwards more often than I wear it forward. I just really love the way that the boat neck kind of came out with that reverse on there. This is another one that I know I had some struggles with. The pattern includes bust shaping as well as no bust shaping, and I was kind of in between sizes, thought I would go for the bust shaping, had to rip it all back, start over again, but I got it done and I'm happy with the way that it looks. I adore the color. This was a thrifted yarn, so I also just feel particularly kind of, I don't know, I like protect my little thrifted yarn projects, because for me then there's an adventure involved along with the knitting process, and I just love the backstory of finding those yarns. It's like a little treasure hunt, a little discovery that turns into a garment that I get to kind of celebrate for, you know, years to come. That yarn was Wool Service Alina. It's a cotton yarn, which is maybe the only cotton project I made all year. And what are the chances that that one also took 47 days from cast on to blocked and wearable? Let's discuss now my Musselburgh by Isolde Teague. Another one I am sure you have heard of, and I jumped on this bandwagon and had the most interesting time with this project. The finished hat, all at full price, comes to a total of $45.42. And that's totally explained by the fiber I chose to use. I indulged on this one as it was a gift knit for my boyfriend, and I chose to knit it with hedgehog fibers, skinny singles in the Orca colorway. I just had a little bit of a battle with this one. I found the pattern, for me, it was a little overwhelming. And then I particularly struggled when it comes to the decreases in this pattern. It's worked in this kind of long tube in a pill shape, as I've referred to it. And when I got to the decreases, it for me got to the point where I was like so ready to be done with it. And you wind up with the fussiest part at the very end of the project. And that's always just such a pet peeve of mine. But of course, it's inevitable in this style of knit. Now, I do feel like I made a little bit of a mistake, and you live and you learn. Like I said, this is only my second year knitting. So of course, I'm bound to make these discoveries. But in a hat, you really do want something that's going to have have that little bit of like negative ease or at least neutral ease to it, so it fits snugly on the head, but isn't squeezing. And working with the skinny singles, it just doesn't have that same kind of flexibility. It would definitely be better suited to something that you're looking for a little more drape with, something like a shawl or a scarf. And as gorgeous as the colorway is, for me, I have a little bit of yarn regret on that one. Yikes, I feel like we have two kind of Debbie Downers in a row. But the next project coming in at $47.48 is the Ciclamen Sweater by Cecilia Garcia Rodrigo, which I chose to knit out of Karen Blossom Cakes, which is a blown yarn. It's a cotton tube and it has acrylic fibers blown into it. I love the color that this is, which is colorway Cabana. Now, I actually had knit my sister a sweater in the same yarn in a different color last year, and I loved the like snuggly kind of sweatshirty vibes that it gave. But I knit this with a 4.5 millimeter needle, and I really think that the yarn would have been better off with a 5 millimeter needle. I think that the 4.5 gave me just a little bit denser fabric than I would love, and that a 5 millimeter would be where it would shine. This garment is a top-down raglan V-neck sweater. It has really interesting details with a ribbing that goes down the sides of the sweater as well as down the sleeves. This one I've kind of classified as like the biggest disappointment of the year. And I think for me, it was just the way that my knitting experience did not lead to anything much better with the finished result. And it kind of left that bad taste in my mouth. Even though it is like a simple top-down raglan, I wouldn't suggest this for beginners. If you're really loving this style and you've knit a couple of top-down raglan sweaters before, I think you'd be fine to figure it out the same way that I did. But it just was a little bit of a challenge, and things I think got a little bit lost in translation, quite literally. Anyway, I knit that one in a size 6, and it was a pretty quick knit, coming in at 32 days. At $50.41, we have a more recently finished object, and this was the Poet's Cardigan by Allison Schmidt. I knit this up for my sister, also using Lion Brand wool ease. And I suppose it's no surprise that these garments are finding themselves at the lower end of the cost spectrum, because we're talking a lot about cotton fibers, acrylic fibers, and blends like that. So that definitely explains why they're all in this lower part of that full price project total price point. This was definitely the most ambitious project that I took on this year. The same aunt that gifted the Folklore Cardigan kit, she also gifted me one to knit for my sister, but I presented my sister with the options of the Folklore Cardigan as well as this Poet's Cardigan. She chose the Poet's Cardigan, and then I learned that it wasn't really a pattern. It was actually Allison Schmidt's free personal pattern on just how she knit the Poet's Cardigan for herself. So it wasn't graded to different sizes. She just did us all a very kind favor and included how she achieved the end result that she did. So I had to just figure this out for my sister's measurements. And I have to say, I am so pleased with how this one turns out. My sister loves it. I love the way that it looks. This is the first time that I got to try on something made out of the wool ease, and I really love the fabric that it produces. And this is another one that was knit up in pieces from the bottom up, and I essentially had to go throughout the pattern and look at the numbers that Allison used, her stitch counts, her gauge. We wound up having the same gauge, which was fortunate, because I could then just say, okay, if Allison had this many stitches on her needles and achieved a garment that had these dimensions, how many stitches should I have on my needles to achieve a garment with these dimensions? So it was a very math heavy experimental project that I'm shocked turned out in the end. Believe it or not, this was one of the quickest full-size garments I made this year at 24 days from beginning to end. At $50.86, we could talk about one of the Emma Mayer patterns that I knit this year, the Clematis Vest. Now, this is that vest that has the buttons that go diagonally. I knit mine out of Sandnesgarn Lena in the black colorway. And that was my first time using Sandnesgarn, which is, of course, just another brand that you hear people talk about all the time. So I feel like I'm a little new to the party here. But really enjoyed the knitting experience with it, as well as just the knitting experience of this garment in general. I love Emma's patterns for the reason I've stated before. I just feel like I've always described my personal style as classic with a twist, and that's exactly how I would describe Emma's patterns. Just the subtlety of details of those buttons going across, and then the way that she writes her patterns, it's so thorough, and yet it's not too wordy. It's not so bare boned. It's a really nice balance. And this is another one that I had, I guess, you know what, sitting down doing this right now, I'm reflecting on all of these things for the first time as a whole. And I don't think I realized quite how many garments I modified this year, but this is one that I kind of had to combine two sizes. I wound up starting it in the size large and then having a little bit of fit issues, even though I was on gauge and doing all the things right. I think just for my body, I wound up having to kind of nip some stitches out from under the arms and knit it a little bit closer to the size medium for the rest of the sweater, or the vest. I definitely think that all of that effort paid off because this is by far one of the most complimented things that I've made this year. Anytime I've worn this out of the house, someone has stopped and asked me about it. And as a maker, you know, that's just like the ultimate best feeling when you get to say, I made it. So that is the Clematis Vest by Emma Mayer, and that one took 30 days to make. Another more recently finished object, we have the Yoga Winter Sweater by Naringa Rook at $65.25. This is a top-down, tall turtleneck raglan sweater, and the best feature is that it has a split hem, but not your average split hem. You actually decrease to create these little trapezoid type shapes at the bottom of the sweater. And I love the look of it. Again, that whole classic with a twist thing was exactly what this spoke to me. However, I couldn't possibly have predicted how much I would love the way that this fit. Now, it was a gamble because a lesson I learned earlier in the year was that we need to do more gauge swatching. And I broke my rule with this one. And it worked out in the end because this one fits so impeccably. And more than that, it's just like the most flattering thing I think that you could wear. This one could be dressed up. It could be dressed down. Excluding the free patterns, of all of the things I made this year, this pattern is the most affordable at $5.25. I knit mine out of Barocco Ultra Wool, which was one of two projects I used this yarn for. This was the worsted weight version in the colorway Bear on 5mm needles. This was a relatively quick knit, I'd say, coming in at 43 days total. Lily Kate France is making her appearance again with the Boulevard Bag at a whopping $69.23. Now, this project does not need to cost this much by any means, but I made some choices with mine that I'm really happy I did, and that also really spiked the project cost for this one. So this is the cutest little crescent shape bag. The moment I saw Lily Kate post about this, I knew I had to have it. I also was able to use some thrifted boucle yarn, this most stunning mohair, hot pink, vibrant boucle. And I used a little more stash yarn for the black finishes, that kind of piping detail that you see. It's such a Lily Kate signature. If you feel like you've knit everything, I promise you've never knit anything like this bag. She includes in the pattern instructions for how to do a double knit strap for it. While I love the look of hers, I really wanted something that was going to have more versatility. I wound up purchasing a strap, so my additional expenses here definitely came in and made this a little bit higher cost project for me than some of the others, but so worth it because because what I wound up doing was adding D rings by kind of crocheting them onto the sides of the purse. And then the strap that I use has lobster claws on the ends. So I can actually wear this at many different lengths and ways. And I just find that for those reasons, it gets a lot of wear. The piping and the way that this all kind of holds its shape is by stuffing zip ties in there, which is so clever and resourceful. I had to buy zip ties for mine, but now I've actually had them for so long now, and they've come in handy more often than not. So get yourself a bag of zip ties. But if you're going to make this, do yourself a favor and figure out how many zip ties it takes to stuff into the piping and make it really nice and rigid, and then take them out and hot glue them all together at the ends so that you kind of wind up with a bulbous end and the individual zip ties can't just sneak out and stab you in the middle of the day. Ask me, I know from experience. Next up at $76.18, we have my most exciting yarn choice I made all year, which was the Japanese paper French linen combo Noro Asaginu, and that is the Vest Claire or the Claire Vest by Mochi Knits. This pattern, it's a little vest top that she offers different options of the little tie fronts or the button fronts. It was super trendy, this style, across mainstream fashion everywhere this summer. And I really wanted to put my own spin on it. So I wound up knitting mine with this paper linen yarn. And what a fun combination. It turned this into the most popcorn knitty experience literally ever, just because the way that the fabric transformed as you were adding more stitches, it was so fun. And it's a top-down construction, so you're adding more and more and eventually knitting back and forth. But this pattern, the real star of this whole show, other than the gorgeous yarn choice, is the clean finishes. Mochi Knits pattern writing style is simplicity, beautiful, perfection, and then all of the little attention to detail things, like the way that she finishes off the whole front of this. I mean, it's just stunning, stunning simplicity. If you're looking for a little vest like this one, I cannot recommend this pattern enough. It's another one too that I think if you knit it up in a woolier wool, something real fuzzy, you just get such a different look, and it would be really fun to have that option. So a pattern that's going to get you really far in the end. And this was, I said, such a potato chippy popcorn knitty type project. It only took me 21 days to complete. Next up at $79.64, we have my personal stash buster project, and that was the Farnham Tee by the Knit Purl Girl. Now, this t-shirt is typically done with stripes, and if you plan to knit this with stripes in it, beautifully written instructions. She tells you exactly how to make all those little stripes line up at the shoulder seams, which to me, those are, again, those little details. Those are just what really sell me on one pattern over another. Now, I chose this pattern because I overall really liked the shape of it. I liked the boxiness and the kind of stubbier sleeves on it. I knit this up during Stash Bust Spring, which meant that I was trying to get 2 yarns out of my stash, and that was Lion Brand True Boo in the colorway Khaki, as well as Universal Yarns Universe in the colorway Bronze. It was such an interesting yarn combination, and they were 2 yarns that I felt like I had originally planned to knit with them kind of on their own, and yet they were no longer speaking to me. So I took it as a sign to challenge myself to come up with something new. And the fabric on this one is the most stellar. I think that's like a little bit punny because it quite literally is like a starry night. It's so beautiful. The Universal Yarns has this metallic thread that runs through it. It's a tinsely thread, and when this one is out in daylight, I mean, it is literally just sparkle. But then the True Boo kind of tones it down, so it's very wearable, very everyday. Now, I made a couple of modifications, surprise, surprise, to mine, because I really felt like the ribbed finishes in the original pattern just didn't lend themselves to the trajectory that this one was taking, where it was turning into this like fancy t-shirt And I felt like adding ribbing was going to make it a little bit too sweatery and a little too casual. So I opted to go for folded hem and I-cord finishes. You don't realize how much those little details affect the outcome of a garment. I thrive creatively when I'm given some sort of parameters. So the idea of putting myself in the sash bust spring kind of bubble and then having these two yarns that I just wasn't loving on their own, I think really lent itself to something beautiful in the end. Next up, at a whopping $80.50, we have another Veronica Lindbergh pattern. This is her stripe hype sweater. I think of everything that I knit this year, I would say that this is the most beginner friendly. This pattern is worth any cent she would ask you to pay for it. It's the most effective and yet just bare bones kind of simple, hit the ground running knitting. There's no shaping in this and yet it fits really well. There's little tips and tricks on how to get those stripes to perform just the way that you want them to without having to weave in all of the ends, even though I did wind up disregarding that. I think it's really fun to use some stash for this one. It was another one part of Stash Bust Spring. I was using yarn that I had left over, the Lion Brand Fisherman's Wool in the colorway Oatmeal, and then a few little thrifted balls of yarn in these fun autumnal colors, as well as another ball of yarn left over from another sweater. So just a really fun project to get those extra scraps out of stash, use them in the stripes, have some fun with it. But also when you are like, I'm going somewhere tonight and I don't want to cast on something random. I'd like a sweater. I'm a sweater knitter. This is the one. It's the most simple start and quick knit for a garment. It's a really, really fun one. Now, of course, I made modifications. I split the hem on mine just for my personal preferences. But otherwise, I really love all of the twisted rib that this one includes. It's a lot of ribbing, but that's the difference between it looking so professional, so store-bought, so clean, so tidy in the finishes. And another one I just can't recommend enough, the Veronica Lindbergh patterns. I knit mine in an extra large on 4mm needles, and it took me 31 days. Next up, we have the project that was on the needles the longest, and that is my Korshavn Cardigan by Tanya Hodney. That was actually the Lion Brand Fisherman's Wool that was left over I was able to use in the stripe hype. This textured cardigan actually came with me from last year into 2024, and I started the channel with this cardigan on the needles and then started this year with it, so it's been through it. It was actually my second time knitting this cardigan. It features this basket weave texture all over, which is surprisingly more simple to knit than you would think if you are new to texture knitting and you're not gravitated towards cables or you're just looking for a little bit of a change up. I think that this basket weave is really fun to get to do a bit of knitting and purling, but not too much purling in the end. This was the first time I had done an Italian cast on. That threw me for a loop, and it was one of those things I sat down on the living room floor and I said, you don't get up until you figure out how to do this. And especially with those bottom up cardigan garment constructions, you're starting out with so many stitches on the needles. It feels impossible, but I figured it out and I'm really proud of that. I also modified this pattern just so that it has a double knit button band instead of the ribbed button band that is featured in the pattern. And I also just changed the shape of the sleeves. So instead of having these balloon sleeves that just kind of are knit straight down and then rapidly decrease at the ends, I did my decreases a little bit more gradually down the sleeve so that it's a little bit more of a straight classic fit. Now, if you've been here since the beginning, you know that the best part of this whole garment is the buttons and the funny story that goes along with them. If you know, you know, and thanks for being here since then if you do. Now, my Korshavn cardigan was knit in a size extra large on 5mm needles, and like I said, the longest whip at 182 days. Next up, at $101, we've officially broken the $100 mark, $101.30 to be exact. We have the Learn to Knit a Men's Sweater by Stacy Perry. This is a fantastic men's quarter zip sweater pattern that I had knit for my dad for his birthday this past January of 2024. I used Cascade 220 Superwash in the colorway Jet, and I knit this for my dad kind of between the sizes large and extra large. Again, kind of starting with the large and then adding some increases. This quarter zip sweater, it has a really clean look because it's basically just like really wide spans of stockinette and then a purl row to break it up. So it's visually interesting without being so difficult to knit. It is knit from the top down and it's a raglan style, which also makes it, I think, a really good choice for gift knitting because you can kind of control how many increases you do. If it's looking like it's not going to be big enough, you can just kind of keep going to the next size, which is essentially what I had done here. I did, of course, modify mine, and I did so by creating a double folded collar on it. It's a standing collar, and for me, I just felt like the single layer on that collar was going to do a lot of like flopping over, and I wanted this to look really crisp and nice if my dad wanted to wear it to work and dress it up a little bit more with like a tie and button down underneath. So I literally just knit double the length on that collar and then wound up folding it in and sewing it down. I did have a challenge where I kind of didn't knit it long enough, and I wound up actually just picking up stitches and knitting a little bit extra because it's on the inside. You'd never see it. And I followed Stacey Perry's tutorial for inserting the zipper on this one, and I have to tell you, stop right now. And if you plan to knit anything with a zipper, specifically a quarter zip sweater, you must follow her video. It's tedious and you have to buy a silly little tool and it might seem unnecessary, but I gotta tell you, this garment, it looks pro, and literally everyone who sees it comments on the zipper. This was also my first time doing any sort of sweater surgery, which was a little bit of a nightmare, but in the end, the one way I could categorize this whole project is simply priceless. I would knit this sweater 10 times over to see my dad wear it with all the pride that he does. It's just the coolest feeling in the entire world to see him go around and enjoy wearing his sweater. He loves it. Other people compliment it all the time, and he gets to say, my daughter made this for me. It's a very cool feeling, the most knit-worthy. And if you want to see what he's getting for his birthday this year, you'll have to check out the Saturday Morning podcast. Coming in at $124 is the Azucena Pullover by Claudia Quintanilla. Now, this is the project where the yarn and the pattern were both gifted to me by Unit Toronto, and it was a cool experience because I got to try out the Knitting for Olive Merino as well as their soft silk mohair for the first time. I chose the colors brown nougat and cream. It was my first time knitting with those Knitting for Olive yarns. It was my first time knitting color work, and I had a great experience. If you are new to color work, I can't recommend this pattern enough. Claudia is another designer that I just adore her writing style. Very simply written patterns. Great if you are otherwise bothered by the chaos of a knitting pattern, but still want all the information that you need. Now, I do kind of lovingly call this one my gingerbread man sweater because I do think it looks like a little frosted gingerbread man. And I did not make modifications to the sweater other than the fact that it's kind of unfinished because it is supposed to have like little pearl beads in the center of all of the flowers that you see. And I never got around to it, but I also wonder if it would affect the wearability of this one. So I'm on the fence. I thought about maybe adding them for the holiday season as a little festive touch. I can definitely see myself doing that in the future. I also think with this one, it's I think the only circular yoke sweater I knit all year. And I think I do like the fit of a circular yoke. Whenever I see a photo of myself wearing one, I think like that looks really nice. And I don't know why, I just don't think to knit them very often. Maybe because we're so inundated with drop shoulders and raglans, it just doesn't come to mind, but I really love the fit of this one. I knit it in a size large on 4mm needles. Another really quick project coming in at 23 days total. Now you may have noticed that hand-dyed yarn is not typically what I'm gravitated towards. And honestly, I think that's how I keep the even full price total of my projects on the lower side. So when you hear a number like this, it's a little bit shocking, especially when you find out that it was for an accessory. So at $124.81, we have My Jose Hood by Norgard Knitters. Now, the yarn for this was gifted from my friend Shayla, and it's knit out of Cake Wool Company, Milk and Cream. That's their fingering weight single ply merino, along with the silk mohair, both in the colorway Waking Dream, which is obviously the most exciting color I knit all year. I loved knitting this garter stitch hood. It has a really cute little bow in the front, and it was really refreshing to finally have something on my needles in color. I definitely didn't come into the year thinking I was going to knit all in neutrals, but I did come into the year hoping to knit a lot more basics for my wardrobe. And so I think for me, that just kind of translated in a lot of the more neutral garments. And I also think that this was a year where I discovered that dark brown might be the better color for me than black. So I kind of got obsessed with it and everything wound up being brown. But things are changing in 2025, I promise. And regardless, I loved having this exciting, bright, punchy color on my needles for the 14 days that I did. Next, we have the knit that I am the most proud of, and that is the Beatrix Cardigan by Gregoria Fibers for $148.67. I knit mine out of Lamb's Pride worsted in the colorway Chocolate Souffle. Here's that dark brown. And Knit Picks Alpaca Cloud Lace in the colorway Hamlet. Held those two together. This Beatrix cardigan is knit from the top down. It was my first time using a saddle shoulder construction, and my favorite thing about the saddle shoulder is the way that the cable detail on this cardigan in particular can travel all the way from the neck edge down to the cuff. I feel like this cardigan is just such a showstopper when you see it in person, and something I really enjoyed playing with this year was knitting texture, which people would typically say to stay away from dark colors when you're knitting texture to make sure you could see all of the work you put into it. But I really liked playing with the depth of a darker color in the texture and the way that that kind of just creates a little bit more of a subtle look. It is so clearly all over textured. It did not need any additional assistance in being able to see that. And I just really love the choice I made for the yarn here. I will say that mine is a particularly jackety cardigan, and I love it even more for that reason. I also used some of my favorite buttons on this one. They're these little antique brass shank style buttons, and the only kind of gripe I had with this one is the button loops. I struggled with the instructions for it. I would consider going back and doing them again if I came up with a better way to do it, but I don't know why for me, mine just came out really large. So if I wear it open, it looks a little bit silly, but it looks fantastic clothes, so who the heck cares? The next garment is my Artemisia Sweater by Emma Mare. So that's the second Emma Mare pattern that I knit this year. This was also a test knit, which meant that I got the yarn at 50% off for the test knit, as well as the pattern was gifted. But I find this one to have some interesting stats because this was the most expensive yarn total I had, even at that 50% off for the mohair boucle that was used here. And it was also the quickest garment I knit this year at 18 days. Now, it makes sense because it's a top-down raglan style sweater, and I feel like I had really departed from that top-down raglan construction by the end of this year. So it was really refreshing to have that simple construction back on my needles. The other fun parts about this one are obviously the boucle texture that it has. It definitely does make this otherwise very simple knit just shine in its own way. Simple silhouette, interesting texture, really, really fun. It also features really clean finishes with all of these folded hem details on the cuffs, on the collar. Now I used Woolfolk Tinned for the outsides of those. The boucle is mohair by Knard in the colorway Walnut. And then I actually had a completely different yarn on the inside of all of my folded cuffs because I had bought it originally, didn't like the color, found the Woolfolk Tinned. I have to say the Woolfolk Tinned is the most surprising yarn and just how soft it was. It was very expensive, but it was so soft and delightful. I think that's one I should bookmark for later use. And finally, with the most expensive full price project total, we have the Feel Good Cable Sweater by Anne-Catherine Stoll. This is the other project that I had knit out of Barocco Ultra wool. However, it was their chunkier version. And this project comes in at $170.19 full price total. So obviously an investment piece. That being said, it's also the super oversized, cozy fit. The sleeves are oversized, the body's oversized. It's top down. It has this V-neck that I, of course, modified as the pattern is supposed to just leave that raw. And I felt like mine really needed a little finishing as it wasn't done the greatest. So I added an I-cord edge to mine. However, the hem, the cuffs on this one, it's all a rolled edge. And so it's a really kind of just beachy, cozy look. As an oversized sweater, it was a huge yarn eater. That chunky weight yarn is typically going to be a more expensive project because you need more of it and there's less on a ball. But the cool news is that the price I paid for this was actually the greatest savings I had across all of my projects this year. Now, I love the just oversized cables of this. It's another one that I knit in between sizes, and I did that by decreasing the stockinette panels that are supposed to be on the sides, and I'm really happy with the way that it turned out. I will say I haven't weighed anything, but I know that this is the heaviest sweater I have knit this year too, which makes sense because a lot of yarn went into it. That being said, it's a fairly quick knit for the mammoth of a sweater that it is. It's knit up on 6mm needles and it took me 45 days. Whew, okay. So that's everything that I knit this year in order of the full price project total from the lowest to the highest. But I also tracked the price that I paid for everything, and I'd love to reorder everything for you in the price that I paid. I am such a bargain shopper. I'm such a budget girly, and I really have found some great deals on yarn as well as additional expenses this year. But of course, I'm also really grateful that some of these projects were made more affordable for me personally, in the way that the patterns were gifted from some amazing viewers, as well as the yarn being gifted from family or from designers like Claudia. So for a combination of reasons, I have saved a lot of money on my knitting this year. And so the grand total of everything that you just saw, if I had paid full price for everything I knit this year, it would have cost me $1,412.61, but that is not what I paid. My personal project totals in order from lowest to highest would be the My Jose hood and the Azucena Pullover, both at $0. That was all gifted. After that, we have the Poets Cardigan, where the yarn was gifted by my aunt. The buttons were what contributed to the cost of this otherwise free pattern, coming in at $1. The Folklore Cardigan, a free pattern, and my aunt had gifted that yarn. Again, the buttons were my only expense at $1.20. The Nettie Scarf that I had knit for my aunt, which was thrifted yarn, and I had that pattern gifted as I did the test knit for Lily Kate. That yarn came in at $1.20. My personal Nettie Scarf, which used the Hjertegården Lana cotton, and the gifted pattern for the test knit was $5.30. The Sailor Swift top, which I utilized the leftover yarn that had been gifted from Claudia Quintanilla earlier in the year. I just paid for the pattern at $6.66. My Tolsta Tank, where I thrifted that yarn and paid for the pattern myself, it was $12.22. The Yoga Winter Sweater, which between the yarn and the pattern, I paid $20.25. My Ciclamen Sweater, for which the pattern was gifted, but the yarn came in at $27.27. My beautiful Beatrix Cardigan, for which the pattern was gifted, and I thrifted half of the yarn, bought the rest of it for a total of $35.07. the Musselburgh hat, which the pattern was gifted, and I bought that single skein of hedgehog fibers yarn for $36.37. The Cordelia skirt, which cost me $36.62. My Boulevard bag, which pattern was gifted to me, and I utilized thrifted yarn as well as had a lot of additional expenses on this one, was $36.95. My stripe pipe sweater cost me $36.97. The Feel Good Cable sweater cost me $48.75. The vest Claire was $49.34. The Clematis Vest was $50.86. My Korshavn Cardigan was $63.91, and I will say that is mostly buttons at $40 for those buttons. My Farnham Tee cost me $65.81. The Learn to Knit a Men's sweater was $82.90. And as my most expensive personal project, even though the pattern was gifted as part of the test knit and I got 50% off of that boucle yarn, my Artemisia sweater cost me $96.50, and that's largely because of the shipping that I had to pay. So my personal knitting project total for the year came out to $715.04. And that included 22 finished objects, of which we had 18 garments and 4 accessories. 23% of them were gift knits, about 10% were test knits. I knit from 18 different designers. I knit 7 sweaters, 4 cardigans, 5 summer knits, 1 skirt, 2 different types of headwear, 2 scarves, and 1 bag. The average cost of the patterns that I had knit was $6.81, and the average days that a project spent on my needles was 38.2 days. To put that into perspective, you could watch the Gilmore Girls series from beginning to end without stopping 8 full times over that same 38 days. That's also the same amount of time that it would take to plant a sunflower and watch it sprout and bloom in entirety. That's also the amount of time it would take an ant to travel about 28 miles. Had I paid full price for all of my projects, it would be like paying $140.17 every month to knit what I did this year. That's literally like going to Disney World for a single day every month, or sitting in orchestra seating at a Broadway show every single month. But because of all of the reasons that I've stated, my personal project total works out to about $59.50 a month to keep up with my knitting habit in the way that I have this year, which is about 12 trips to the coffee shop, getting a cup of coffee 12 times over the month. That's also about as much as it would cost to sign up for a subscription box for OC. I think that the point that I'm trying to make is that when you look at your knitting as a whole, I find it so fascinating to break it down by all these different aspects and put it all into perspective. It's obviously an expensive hobby, and there are ways to go about it in a budget-friendly way, like thrifting, like finding those sales and getting the yarn for the projects you know you're going to make when they are at discounted prices. But I also think it's important to remember that I honestly, when I sat down to film today, I was like, what the heck am I going to wear? Because everything that I wear on a daily basis is sitting behind me. This craft is the equivalent of having that hobby, in addition to, for me personally, not really purchasing from the stores as much anymore. For every garment that I made, it was one less that I bought at the store. And so when you're looking at the projects as a whole, I think it's really important to remember that. But I also have been passionate, as long as I've had my YouTube channel, about sharing the transparency of what this craft costs. There are so many ways to go about knitting, and there are so many ways to make it affordable as well as indulgent, and I am certainly here for all of it. I wish that I had more time to really dive deeper on these projects, but I would love to know if you have any specific questions, because I'm going to make a follow-up video featuring my most worn garments, a little bit of the care now that I've had some of these things, as well as things I knit last year for a year, and just to see how things are holding up. But if you want to know anything in particular that I can answer in that future video, I would love it if you would let me know down below. I also want to know, what is a thing that you made this year that you are the most proud of? Please tell us. And of course, I just want to say a huge thank you for not only watching this video, but to those of you who have been with me for this entire year. I knew that I found something special when I found knitting back in January of 2023. But I never could have imagined the road I would wind up on by creating this space on YouTube, where I'm so proud of the space that we've built together. So thank you again for closing out a year with me.
It's a holiday giveaway.
It's a holiday giveaway! To enter this week's giveaway, leave a comment with the first pattern that you are dying to knit in 2025. Make sure to include hashtag New Year in your comment to enter, and all comments must be in by Friday, January 3rd to be considered. The winner will be announced in podcast 68 on Saturday, January 4th. Make sure you're subscribed to be eligible to win. Good luck! And with that, if you did enjoy this video, I would so appreciate it if you would go ahead and give it a thumbs up. If you subscribe and ring the bell, you're going to be notified anytime I post a new video. However, you can always count on there being a Saturday morning podcast at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And with that, a big old thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. All right, you guys, bye!